Yeah, it's one of those things. I remember talking with people where they say, "Oh, it's building code." And I'm like, "Well, let's talk a little bit about what building code means."
Mm.
Building code means it's the minimum standard required to pass to be something that's somewhat of a functional building. Now, if you have a son and his name's Timmy, and little Timmy runs home, says, "Mom and Dad, guess what? We're going out. We're celebrating tonight. We're going to go out for steaks and it's going to be amazing." Well, why are we going and celebrating, little Timmy? Well, because I got a passing grade. I got 51%. And that to me is what the building code is. It means that you are at the minimum standard, not the maximum standard, but the minimum standard to be viable. And welcome back to the Money, Mindset, and Mentoring Process. We have Mike Kaeding today, and I'm super excited to talk with him because we're talking about something passionate that I have, which is real estate. And Mike's mission with the company Norhart is to really address the cost of living today in North America. He said America, but I'm going to say North America because I think, Canada, we've got a massive, massive challenge around this as well. And one of the things that I really loved about our conversation before was that your mission is to reduce the cost of building in North America. And you've set some really lofty goals around that. So we'll get into that in a minute, because I think building, it's one of those things that you said, it really hasn't been rethought in a very long time. We've got so many industries that's gone through rapid changes, but this is one of the sort of last bastion about how things had operate before. And we're going to talk a little bit about what you look like looking in the future is what it could look like in the future. So Mike, welcome to the show. Appreciate having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about, what kind of gives you the right to look into this space and say that things should get done differently. Because I mean, there's going to be some old people in the club and say, "Hey, we've been here for a long period of time." And what kind of gives you that clout to kind of say, "Hey guys, I'm going to raise my hand and say, what should we do differently?" So talk to me.
hmm Yeah, well, part of it's that we're actually doing it already. But if you look at the
Boom.
past 60 years, industries like manufacturing have improved labor productivity by 760%. But if you look into the world of construction, it stayed basically flat at just 10% improvement over that entire time. It's horrible. Right? And so all we're doing is we're taking the lessons learned from these other industries and applying it to the world of construction. And by doing so, we are able to produce buildings at about 20 to 30% less than other developers. And we believe that over time, we can achieve a 50% reduction in those costs. But imagine what that means. That means someday your rent could be half, or your mortgage payment could be half. That's our dream, is to solve that housing affordability. And the reason I can be confident in saying that is because we are already achieving at least that 20 to 30% today.
So, and those are just unbelievable numbers. And guys, if you're not in the construction space, there's many contractors today that work on razor thin margins. So it's
Mm.
not as if it's rich in profit. I know when I had an HVAC company, I mean, if you're running with a 5 or 7% margin, that was like, woohoo, this is great when you're working on some of these big projects, because let's face it, construction's where the rubber hits the road. You can't have these situations where you're kind of getting it. It's either it's working or it doesn't, because it is a situation of absolutes when you're working in construction. So when you're talking about the idea of reducing costs by 20 or 30%, where are we starting to see those costs? Like, where are you finding those big successes?
Yeah, it's 10,000 little things. But to give you some flavor of it, one of the first things we did, we started bringing all the work under one roof. So, in the world of construction, you typically have a bunch of different companies that come together to work on a project and then they disperse. Your plumber is different than your electrician, that's different than the HVAC, different than the general contractor, so on and so forth. So by bringing all of that work under one roof, we can save some profits right there. You talked about the 6%. So there's a little bit of savings there. But once we do that, once we bring the work under one roof, we can start applying some very simple techniques that improve efficiency for everyone. If you think for a moment, if a construction company were to produce a car, you'd have a different company installing the windshield, a different company installing the door, and a different company installing the wheel. And of course, the wheel company, they would call you up one day and say, hey, I am so sorry. I got delayed on another project and I can't get out there for another 2 weeks. Your entire line would be shut down. And see, in the world of manufacturing, they look at us and says, we're crazy. But we look back at them and say, this is the way it's always been done. So by bringing all that work under one roof, we can apply an example technique is the assembly line. I know it's revolutionary, right? But how in the world can you take a building and drive it down a line? Well, you can't. But what you can do is you can take the person and move them through the building. So right now, our teams shift through the building by about 1 unit every 5 hours. And then if you look at the end of our building, every 5 hours, we have a brand new apartment unit completed. And that one technique can take a building that might take 15 months and drive it down to 9. But there are dozens, I mean, literally 10,000 of techniques like that when brought together, they start having a meaningful impact and driving down those costs.
So when we look at that, I mean, you hit a lot of things, and I want to kind of unpackage a couple of them because I think you hit some really important things. So first of all, the idea of bringing everybody under one house, and so the one thing that it does for the sub trade is what it does is it consolidates their client expectations.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, one of the big inefficiencies as a sub trade, it isn't the idea of isn't the idea of necessarily their inefficiencies, but it's client inefficiencies. And I can say that, owning a sub trade company, an HVAC company for a few years, it's when you send your crew, they drive an hour and a half to get to that job site, and you show up and it's not ready. And then you've now got that day allocated in your schedule. So now you've got to remove that day and try to pivot them to be sort of half available at the next one. And so now they got to drive a half a day to get to the next job, or even just down the road. Let's just say it's all in the same subdivision. So you got to drive down the road and set up on the next place. So already you've lost some daily inefficiencies by doing that. Now that customer who was supposed to be ready that day now says the next day, hey, I'm ready, but you already booked it the next job.
Yeah.
So now you have all of these losses that happen in scheduling losses just by bringing all the expectations together, that you have a unified front that, hey guys, we all are working in unison. I can totally see that. There's one company that's local to my area that does that, and they do an absolutely amazing job because they have all the trades under one roof. Now, some general contractors will claim that they've got all of the trades under one roof because their sub-trades are loyal to them, right? They come back to every job. But the challenge arises for the sub-trade is, do they have enough work to keep them working full time?
Yeah.
Because if they don't have enough work to keep them full time, they have to find other jobs to fill those spaces. So inevitably, the general contractor is loyal to that one trade, but that trade, because of just revenue obligations or growth obligations, like they want to grow, they can't be loyal to that one general contractor. So when you bring those people all underneath one roof, you've got to have scalability obligations to the people working for you, because if you don't have enough work for them to show up again and again and again and again, like as you say, the assembly line, they're going to have to find other assembly lines to jump on. And how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we ended up doing is, it's not only subcontractors, they're employees. The whole team, every single one, from sourcing and supply chain to engineering and architecture, down to the guys on the line, everyone's an employee. And so what we do is we just line up project after project after project. So the plumbers, they actually go from unit 101 to 102 to 103. And once at the end of the building, maybe 550, then they move right to the next building on the very next day. They never have any of those scheduling hiccups as a result. You also talk about inefficiencies just generally on the contractor side. So yes, scheduling is a part of it, but another part of it is architecture engineering, like designing a unit and a design that actually is easy to build. You would think that's a normal and common thing to do, but it's not. And the problem is the architects and engineers, they're incentivized to get you a code compliant plan that's it. That's their goal, just to get past that hurdle. They're not in it to make it more efficient. That means their expenses are higher. And so the incentives are all out of whack. And so we learned we can't even have architecture and engineering be a third party company. We had to bring that in house so that our engineers could literally be on the line with the guys feeling the work that they're dealing with and then designing plans that actually improve their work. But that doesn't happen at all in the world of construction because those things are so incredibly separate.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I remember talking with people where they say, "Oh, it's building code." And I'm like, "Well, let's talk a little bit about what building code means."
Mm.
Building code means it's the minimum standard required to pass to be something that's somewhat of a functional building. Now, if you have a son and his name's Timmy, and little Timmy runs home, says, "Mom and Dad, guess what? We're going out. We're celebrating tonight. We're going to go out for steaks and it's going to be amazing." Well, why are we going and celebrating, little Timmy? Well, because I got a passing grade. I got 51%. And that to me is what the building code is. It means that you are at the minimum standard, not the maximum standard, but the minimum standard to be viable. And that's in design and that functional design and everything. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the architects will maybe subordinate to the interior design people who say that bulkhead can't be there because I just don't think it's pretty. But
Mm.
meanwhile, if you get rid of that bulkhead, now all of a sudden you have so many building inefficiencies happen as a result, so that the next people come in, they have to redesign on site. And this is one of the problems that happens a lot in building, is building design doesn't happen based on plan. It happens as the trade shows up, they now have to navigate because the path that they thought they were going to run their ductwork is now taken up because they didn't make provisions for the drain that needs to go from the unit above. So I think where you have that all internal, that everybody's accountable to each other. When Joe shows up, who designed the plan, and Sally's the one who's installing the plumbing, says, "Hey, Sally, in the next team meeting for the building, as we're chatting, you've just made my job 3 times more difficult because as I show up, I now can't get done what I need to get done because you wanted to make that room just look a little bit different."
It's so right. It's not that we don't run into the same problems. We do, but I think the fundamental difference is that when the team runs into that problem, the bulkhead's in the wrong spot, they've got to redesign some plumbing fixture, something has gone screwy. They then go back to the architecture and engineering team, and that team incorporates the lessons and the learnings of that problem so that we don't have to face that problem again. But that doesn't
Mm.
happen in normal building because once you're done with one building, you're just done. You're moving on to a different project. But we get to continually learn and grow from that experience.
Well, I think that the thing that allows that to happen is, whenever I'm doing coaching sessions with people, and a lot of times it's with, business owners or people in the sales space and marketing space, is what we do is we coach through 3 different elements. And the 3 different elements are, number one, we talk about attitude. And
Mm.
and the second thing we talk about is approach. And the third thing we talk about is activity. So we call it the 3 A's. And, a lot of times you'll see the problem show up in the last one, which is activity. And that's where most people start to, really hone around. If it's salespeople, it's talking about, you're not making enough phone calls, you're not closing enough deals.
Yeah.
But really, if you really want to solve the problem, you get out of there and you get right up to the first A, which is attitude,
Mm.
right? And what you're doing is, by your structure and the way that you're handling your build, is you're solving the attitude right away because you're creating congruent goals and a congruent vision. Because let's
Yes.
face it, if everybody's working for the same company, they're all have a job and they all have a success with their family and all these things that are really important to them, if by that company having viability.
Hmm.
And so the P&L that they're caring about is a unified P&L across all of the whole thing.
Yeah.
So maybe if you're doing profit share, I don't know if you do anything like that, but if you're doing something where everybody benefits as a result of everybody being congruent and saying, "Look, guys, we're going to solve this. Maybe we're not going to get it perfect this time," because you're absolutely right. it's never going to be perfect all the time. It's not feasible to think that that's going to be the case. Sometimes you have a batch of concrete that shows up that's wrong. Sometimes, I mean, we had 1 year we had like 50 hydronic pumps that all just started to delaminate, and they would just break. Like it was crazy. It was nuts. And you can't plan for those things. But what you can plan for is the reaction to those things. Because I think people's true testament to somebody is when things are going great, everybody's fine. But the second something goes wrong, that's when their true character shows up. Yeah. And when you have a company that has an aligned goal, when things go wrong, the true character is, how are we as an entire entity going to solve this? Whereas if you have a bunch of different distributed decision makers, it's about, how do I protect my own private P&L? And everybody runs away from the hand grenade. Right?
Exactly. I love your perspective there on attitude. You know, I think fundamentally, the biggest thing that I focus on is actually on hiring. Because it really comes down to, you want the best people. You know, we fight to find the best people in our industry. We will fly people in from other states to come work during the week and then fly them home on the weekend. One of our staff members in 2007, Steve Jobs announces the brand new iPhone. Steve Jobs walks off stage and our employee walks on that same stage following Steve Jobs' announcement. It's that caliber of people. And the crazy thing is, when you bring people on at that level, they've got the attitude, but not only that, but they're unlocking doors. They make things happen. They discover new ways to do things that revolutionize what you're doing. Of course, the feedback I always get at this stage is, Mike, that sounds expensive. But from my perspective, the best people with that right attitude, they're worth 2 to 5 to 10 times as much compared to the average worker. And so if you look at it on a cost per unit produced, the best people are actually your least expensive, and they change the game.
Absolutely agree with that. And you know, the most expensive person is that day labor guy who doesn't show up.
Yeah.
And because then the whole machine starts to fall apart. And so I think I 100% agree with you. The idea is, number one, even the most expensive person is not paid what they're worth. And the reason being is because the company exists because the output is worth more than what you've paid them. And so, or else you don't have a company. Now, if you have a bunch of little companies, what happens is you have all of this stuff that, you know, where you have these separate, disparate ideas of things that need to happen, and where you have that single entity. Like I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. And if you also then can create a single vision that can be greater than the individual vision. And I think when you're looking at hiring and recruiting, it's probably fairly easy in a market where they're running into material shortages, they're running into staffing shortages, they're passionate about what their trade is. So if it's somebody hydronic guy or somebody in sheet metal, somebody in plumbing, whatever it is, and you're looking at that functional level, the idea of saying, look, we can probably pay you more, and I'm talking net going into your bank account, than when you're running your own business, because you're right now chasing delinquencies. You're right now chasing employees that aren't showing up. You're right now chasing, you know, manufacturers and distributors that you show up and they don't have material for you. You're going through all of these inefficiencies, whereas we've got it all. All you got to do is show up and do the thing that you love.
Yeah.
And doesn't that feel good?
Yeah, I could agree more. I've many of our best team members had their own business, and it's that very reason. It's like, dude, I can come work for you. I can make as much, or if not more, but now I eliminate all those other headaches. So my life becomes easier, and I can focus on what I love to do in a culture and people that I love doing it with.
Absolutely. When I was in the HVAC space, we were building some pretty large places, you know, largest being like 55,000 square foot single family home. So these are not small houses and very complicated projects. I absolutely love the technical side of it. And, you know, I love the building side of it. I love bringing people together. I hated chasing the money. And there was so many times I actually ended up in 2014, we ended up shutting the doors because chasing the money became such a heavy burden that I closed the door with $750,000 in the hole. And I had to I paid off all my small suppliers. I left that industry, and when I look at that and I said the inefficiency of the way money moved in that space caused brain drain. And I'm not going to toot my own horn that I was really good, but I know I was really good because you can't be on projects like that over and over and over again if you're not really good. And I didn't
Mm.
advertise. And so, but it was unfortunately, I took on a couple bad players and that caused a problem in my business.
Mm.
And so you look at the brain drain that can happen out of that space because somebody's going to be sitting there working in some basement, assembling some, fire retardant system or whatever else they're doing. Um, and, and they're looking across at their buddy who's sitting in their kitchen, slamming away on the computer, working for some tech company, going, why am I doing this? I'm chasing all of this work. Why am I doing this when this guy can get paid the same as I do and sitting there? And when their kids don't go to school that day because, they have some sort of, shutdown or pandemic or whatever. And I have all of these problems and that person's just, the kids are working at home. They're working at home. And so if you can solve that problem of creating that community that takes away all that agony and gives that community of support because everybody has the same vision, because everybody's going through the same problem and everybody wants to win together, I think that's massive.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's what we're trying to create.
Now, how do you feed the front end of projects?
Yeah. So for us, we've been able to do all of our own projects using, frankly, bootstraps. Like it's all my own capital, my own equity. And so we just build the projects we choose to build, and we have a pipeline of projects in front of us. And it's been great because if you think about it, if we have $100 million building, if our costs are 20 to 30% less, that means our costs are, say, 75% of the overall value. So 75 million. A bank will typically fund about 75% of a project. It doesn't take a math whiz to realize that we can build, buildings at more or less less than what the banks will provide us, which is just crazy. That's unheard of in our industry. And what's great then is the day it opens, we've immediately have a $25 million gain. And so that's how we've been able to grow so fast and rapidly over the last decade. Now, in the last year or so, it's changed a little bit because as interest rates rise, that means loan proceeds go down. So our banks were funding 75%, now they're down to 55%. So there's a gap there that we've had to pivot and learn and find new ways to bridge. But like, that's my history. That's like our history as a company. Every step of the way, you get punched in the gut with something new, and you've got to learn and pivot and find a new way to solve it. And so now we don't have to stop, but we're now raising capital in ways that we didn't have to before.
Nice. And you know what? I think a lot of the market's doing the exact same thing. I think, and it's interesting because the people down in the trenches are taking the pivot. You're taking the pivot. And now what class are you working in of buildings? Like what type of buildings are you building and where are you building? Tell me a little bit about that element. Like what's your niche?
Yeah, so we build apartment buildings. They range from, I would say, Class B up to Class A. Our latest project is honestly one of the very nicest in the state. 7-story building. It's got a brand new transit line that's stops at the front door. Restaurant, coffee shop, co-working space, thousands of square feet of amenity space, rooftop patio and grill, penthouse suites with floor-to-ceiling windows, 22 feet high, views of downtown, both cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. It is a gorgeous property. Now, there's a bit of a lesson in there. We probably took it too far, and we didn't get our normal cost savings as a result in that project. But most of our projects is in, I would say, sort of a B+, A- class. And that's where we play the best in.
And how many units are you typically building at a time?
Our ideal is somewhere between 300 to 500. I would say right now we're probably averaging about 300 a time.
And then after you build them, do you keep them or do you sell the unit? Do you sell the package?
We historically have kept them. We have sold a little bit recently just because of the capital crunch with the banks.
Yep.
But generally we try to keep them.
Generally try to keep them. Nice, nice. What does the future look like for you? If you were going to sort of take the lens out really far and kind of say, this is where we're going to be. Tell me what that would look like.
Yeah, our dream over the next decade is to reach 192,000 units under management with a 60,000 unit per year construction pace. And the reason is at that stage, we're starting to produce enough units for any given market that we're now having an impact on supply and demand. See, if you were to go look at our rental prices right now, you'd say, Mike, they're at about the same as everybody else. Like, you talk about lowering rents, but how are you actually doing that? Your rents are just the same. The magic, the key really is in driving up that production level. Because as we start producing that many units to a given market, supply, the high supply, starts bringing down the cost for everyone in that market. And the key there is all about in building the infrastructure, the system that builds those buildings. And that's really the hard point. Elon Musk talks about how it's hard to produce a car, but it is 10 to 100 to 1,000 times harder to build the system that builds that car. That's really what we're working on over the next decade, is we're taking the profits we're earning and putting it into building the system that builds housing.
That's amazing. And are you going to start, where are you expanding to on your builds? Obviously, we're talking about Minneapolis. Are we expanding some other territories? What are we looking at doing?
Yeah, so right now we're in Minnesota. We do have some manufacturing capabilities in Wisconsin. But our next location we're looking at going to is into Texas. And the reason for that is quite simple. Well, one, there's good demographics. But the other thing is there's just a lot of population in a pretty small zone. See, for us to build out this system, we don't want to spread all across the country. We want to be able to do it in a condensed space so we can build up, in a lot of ways, a manufacturing plant, manufacturing system to build this housing. So Texas gives us some room to grow. And then after that, it will likely be the Sun Belt part of the country. And then expanding, hopefully, eventually nationwide.
Nice. Any desire to expand into Canada? Just throwing that out there, being a Canadian.
We do. Yeah, we do eventually hope to get up to Canada.
Nice.
It's a little later on the roadmap, though. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. Well, that's amazing. If there's one thing you could tell the listeners about what it takes to do to get to where you first had the inception point of, man, I'd really like to start something like this, to where you are today, what's kind of the one takeaway you could tell somebody to kind of stay to the course and do the things that you're doing, the pretty amazing stuff you're doing?
Yeah, we've built up to about a $200 million company today, and we have our own show where I get to interview, literally billionaires on a regular basis. And there's something different between people who think at a $1 billion level and those who think at sort of a day-to-day level, or even frankly a millionaire level. And it's not necessarily their skill or their ambition or what have you. It's really at the heart of it, their mindset. Because every step of growth, you're going to get punched in the gut like nobody's business. You're going to be facing problems that you had no idea how to solve. And it takes an immense amount of massive action, failing a ton, to find the one little sliver of a way to make it through. And what's crazy is the problems that you face early on will feel insurmountable. But after you pass that and make it a few other rungs higher, you'll look back and be like, dude, that was an easy problem. I don't know why that felt so massive to me. But you have to have the tenacity and the wherewithal to know that that's just a phase. That's just what you have to get through, that we're all terrible at what we start initially. And that's okay. But if you can have that tenacity, that mindset to get through it, despite feeling horrible, that's really the key to success in the long term.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you.
Really interesting story. He was the founder of Byte. He sold his business for $4 billion. And he went through a point where 2 years, he came down to only having like $1,000 left in his bank account. He had to wind down his company massively, like just barely scrape by. And he didn't take a vacation or day off, not Saturday or Sunday, for 2 years. But by putting that energy in after that point, he started growing and making massive success.
Yeah, I think the idea is, when I had that issue that the 750 seemed like a big number,
Yeah.
what somebody told me is they said, well, make it a small number by finding bigger problems. And so as soon as you start finding bigger problems, your little problems, what you once thought were big, become so small because there's something bigger out there that you need to solve. And I thought that was really good sage advice.
Yeah, it's so good. I could not agree with that more.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I think your mission is a beautiful mission. I think it's very, relevant in today's market because certainly housing costs and just costs overall is one of the number one themes in the average American and Canadian household. And to be able to say that you've got not only an idea, but you've got a proven roadmap of success in doing this, I think that gives a lot of people a lot of hope that the future looks pretty bright. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Really excited to see you grow and love to connect again, as you get even closer to your mission of making a change in the market across the nation. So thank you for being with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This has
Thank
been
you.
fun.
With that, guys, we are finished this episode of the Money, Mindset, and Mentoring podcast. Look forward to seeing you on the next one.